welcome everybody to this launch of the joint thematic review of young people in police detention. I'm Judge Carruthers, and with me at this table is Dr. Russell Wills, who's the Children's Commissioner, and the Chief Human Rights Commissioner, Mr. David Rutherford. What we're going to do is to each speak briefly about the review, and then we're happy to answer questions, and after that we'll adjourn. And I'm going to speak first. I don't think we decided that, but I've decided that. This review is the first of its kind. It's the first of its kind under OPCAT, which is the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. And New Zealand is, of course, a signatory to that protocol. And what is unusual, and the first of its kind, is that this review is a joint one and has been conducted by the Independent Police Conduct Authority, which I chair, the Children's Commission and the Human Rights Commission. And all of those three are designated as national preventive mechanisms under the protocol. And the significance of that is that the national preventive mechanisms have an obligation to monitor policy and practice and procedure in places of detention in order to prevent torture or ill treatment. And the main focus for us all, of course, is on systemic issues. The Independent Police Conduct Authority has a particular interest in police cells and police detention as part of its ordinary mandate, and others here have obvious and different interests which they will speak to. This work began in 2010. It began under the chair of three quite different people, so we three have come into this work and we're the initiators of it. But it was designed to examine the conditions and treatment of young people in police detention, and to ensure that this happened only as a last resort, and to ensure also that the detention complied with international standards. And I think the three of us would like to emphasise right at the outset that the police and child, youth and family have been fully cooperative in this review to a remarkable extent, and have demonstrated a common concern that the use of police detention is a last resort. So we've had nothing but cooperation from police and from child, youth and family in that regard. I want to particularly thank the people from the Independent Police Conduct Authority who were responsible for this work. Janice Adair, Manager of our Investigations, was the leader. Jessie Slankard, Claire Tattersall, and then later Andrea Jamison came in and did a review and polishing job on the whole of the work, and I'm delighted with the result. There are various recommendations made, and you will have read those. They fall into three categories. Some relate to factors which result in detention, and those are addressed by the review. There are others which deal with the treatment of young people whilst in detention, and others finally relate to the sharing of information, data collection, monitoring of issues, which are important as we try and address what can usefully be done in the future. And the reason for all that is quite simple. Everyone has an appreciation of the inappropriateness of police cells for detaining young people. They were never designed for young people to be detained in them. They don't help young people respond in a constructive way to their offending, and they sometimes can make it worse. And so detention sometimes makes it much more difficult to treat young people in accordance with our legislation, and also in accordance with international obligations which we have accepted. The three of us accept an obligation as part of our organisations to follow up these recommendations. We'll be doing that on a regular basis to ensure compliance in the future, and in fact we don't envisage any problems about that because of the enthusiasm of the police, child, youth and family to comply and to use detention as a last resort. So I finally just want to say I'm very proud of the quality of this report and of the part that IPCA has played in it. I'm very pleased with the contribution that we've made. I spoke with Principal Youth Court Judge Beecroft this morning, who's of the same mind and supports the work. we are very hopeful that this will form a foundation for useful work in the future. Now I'm going to ask the others to speak briefly too. Dr. Russell.
Well, it's a tremendous report, and I really encourage you to read it in its entirety. When young people need to be arrested for their own safety or the safety of the community, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to turn their lives around so that they don't end up with a life of imprisonment. So it behoves us to make the most of that opportunity, to make sure that everything we possibly can do to intervene in the lives of those young people, to get them off a criminal pathway into a productive one, are taken advantage of. And that's really the whole point. That's the purpose of arrest and detainment. The second point I want to make is that this affects all of us in society. We have a very high rate of imprisonment in New Zealand, and particularly for Māori. And it costs about $100,000 a year to keep someone in prison. One of the best opportunities we have to reduce that prison population and the burden on taxpayers is to intervene with young people and to make sure that every opportunity like arrest and detainment is used to make sure they come off that pathway and stay off. The third point I want to make is that this is an example of how powerful it is when three organisations with quite different reasons for being address a wicked problem like young people in detention. Dr. David Rutherford from the Human Rights Commission, the IPCA and the Office of the Children's Commission, each have a quite different perspective. When you put that together, you have a really powerful way of improving a complex problem like young people have been arrested and detained. And this is where government's going. All the simple problems really have been solved. What's left are wicked problems. And they require agencies like ours to get together with their multiple perspectives to get a really comprehensive solution to a problem like that. I think this is a very good example of how three organisations can get together and address a really complex problem like young people in custody.
Good. Right.
So just firstly, just let me endorse what Russell's just said. OPCAT is an interesting organisation in New Zealand in that it's made up of a number of national mechanisms. Three of them are here, and two of them aren't. And the role of the Human Rights Commission is really to coordinate the national preventive mechanisms insofar as our relationship with the United Nations bodies is concerned. So there's a regular reporting to the Committee Against Torture. And it isn't that people are being tortured, but the covenant covers cruel and unusual punishment, and therefore can capture in places of detention, which is why you find this currently. I think it's also just worth noting that this is a human rights issue, and human rights weren't invented offshore for application in New Zealand. We've got veterans returning right now from LMA, where they fought against the Nazis explicitly under the banner of fighting for freedom and human rights. And a declaration made on the 1st of January 1932. So this is a manifestation of something that New Zealanders have actually fought and died for in terms of human rights. And we played a big part in a lot of these conventions being made. The critical thing about OPCAT is it's designed to prevent bad things happening by ensuring that someone has got some oversight over those who keep people in detention. So it is fundamentally to prevent. Secondly, find the truth as partially and promptly as we can if something has gone wrong, to make sure that people are looked after if they need to be looked after by way of rehabilitation, and then and only then worrying about things like compensation and justice. So it's fundamental things to prevent things happening, and that's what this is about. And I think one of the things I just really want to emphasise is, firstly, that we, again picking up what the others have said, we think that the government is on the right track. We think the police are on the right track with their prevention first strategy of trying to get people off the tracks of ending up in prison in the first place. Totally agree with Russell that this is a massive opportunity when people are detained to turn things around. And I think the other final point would just be to say that in business I learned that in God we trust and everyone else brings data. And one of the really important learnings from this is the need for good data to understand why people are being detained, why they are being charged, and are we doing that right? And that requires detailed data in order to understand that and get better. So that's really all I've got to say. Really, completely endorse the report, and also endorse what Russell's comment about us, the power of different perspectives being multiplicity. Thank you.
Thank you. I now invite questions which you might want to make specifically to one of us. If you make it general, we'll just make sure that that's relevant to that system. Are there any questions?
In 2006, when young people in police cells would be more than 24 hours, it's a huge decline. Up to 2009, we had this graph. And then it creeps upwards. What happened then and what is happening now? Is that of concern?
Well, I think I can answer that because the problem goes back well before that. I used to be the principal youth court judge before Judge Beecroft, and in my time, which is now some years ago, there was a problem as well about young people detained in police cells. It rises and falls, and sometimes that's a response to facilities being built by Child, Youth and Family. We've had over the years 2, I think 3 more added. And some were closed. So there have been sometimes a lack of other options. And then there are sometimes different practices throughout the police districts. I think we still see something of that even today. So I can remember the problem being very much worse than it was now. I can remember it getting better for a bit, then dropping off again. And I'm sure we'll see those sorts of continued movements. Part of what the review suggests is better information so that everyone can see what's happening and interpret those and make sure that those patterns are ironed out. So it's a last resort stuff. There will continue to be, I'm sure, some fluctuations, but with better information they'll be managed better.
Has there been a shift from youth back then to youth now management?
I can only speak for the period that I was involved in it. There was a determination, a growing determination to keep young people out of police cells for all the obvious reasons. And that's a few years ago now. But those things erode, and you can get hard local problems which make things difficult for police and others. I think we've got a much better national approach to it now.
With this emphasis on prevention, how do you strike the right balance between ensuring you're nipping in the bud with these young offenders and keeping enough grease on the beat for the older offenders? I mean, there's this big emphasis on not pulling back frontline numbers, I know, but if we're doing all this work with the young ones, we all know that 400 mil has to come off the police budget from somewhere. How are you doing that physically?
Right, that's a good question for David Rutherford.
It's probably really a question for the Police Commissioner, but I think what you are seeing with the Prevention First strategy, which is largely based on the success of the county Thematic strategy, is that targeted intervention is the right sort of way to go. We know from the survey on crime, for example, that 56% of the assaults in New Zealand, and that's of all the assaults, not just the 10% that are reported, are done on 6% of the people. So the police are not only focusing on multiple offenders, they're also focusing on multiple victims as part of Prevention First. So I think it's being smarter. And I think also it's about learning from the police districts that are actually doing well. There's quite, as Judge Carter says, there's quite a variation between police districts, and that's on the same budget.
David, you mentioned that it was quite important to collect data as well. So what kind of data is being collected? Because I hear that things are being collected like the EV, for instance, and I'm interested to know how that information will be used to help improve impaired samples.
I mean, that's one of the concerns that the Human Rights Commission has, is are we collecting the right data? And it's not just who's ending up in prison, but why they're ending up in prison. So what's the difference between how one group of New Zealanders is being treated from the other, and maybe how the discretion is being exercised? And I think it's at that level that we don't have a clear enough picture just yet.
Isn't there going to need to bring in a whole lot of other agencies as well then, your education and health? Are you looking to expand these questions as to why to bring in those other agencies to help out?
Well, one of the vehicles for that, of course, are local children's teams. So one of the key initiatives out of the white paper, Vulnerable Children, is to do exactly what you're talking about, to bring together health, education, social services, police, child, youth and family together, because we know these families. They're not a mystery, they don't just pop out of nowhere. And they have, in fact, often quite predictable life courses from when they first present with behavioural problems to my clinic at, say, 4 or 5, to when they're arrested and detained at, say, 14 or 15. And what children's teams should do is wrap the appropriate services around those family, provide the support they need to turn those lives around. And the best intervention is early. So long before kids come to be arrested or detained. And so a focus on particularly the first 5 years of life, early primary, wrapping good services around those kids, that's going to make a really big difference to young people being arrested and detained.
This might be a silly question, but how do you pick an offender that young then? If they haven't, if you're talking about really good, is this the kid that steals the other kid's lunchbox at kindy, or how far back do you have to go to nip and divide?
Well, one of the things about living in New Zealand is that we have 2 longitudinal studies from Dunedin and Christchurch. We've got the best evidence on that question of anywhere in the world. And unfortunately, we also have very high numbers. So we've got a lot of experience in intervening early with children and young people whose behaviour is causing concern. What we know is that severe behaviour disturbance at 4 is highly stable unless you intervene. We also know that when we use tools like those used in the Before School Check, it's called the Strength and Difficulties Questionnaire, and when the nurse and the Before School Check and the teacher have a good relationship, can identify those kids well, and can then refer to an evidence-based program like, say, the Incredible Years program, 3/4 of those kids come off the conduct disorder pathway and stay off. It is an incredibly cost-effective intervention, well evidence-based, and we know, for example, that Māori and Pacific kids who go through those programs have the same success as New Zealand European kids. So we've got the skills, we've got the evidence base to do this, and I think that what we should see with those early intervention programs over the next few years is the number of young people being arrested and detained should fall, and in time the prison population should fall too.
Why do you think that the numbers are increasing over the past 3 years?
I think that's a really difficult one to know. The person, as David said, to answer that, probably the police commissioner. There's never a single reason for a complex problem like that. There are many, many reasons. What the report shows is how to intervene at that time of arrest and detainment. And it gives a really clear steer about how we can intervene and make the most of an opportunity to make sure those kids do come off that pathway and onto productive life.
Will you expect the trend to reverse after this report?
Well, I think what we expect is that there will be much greater scrutiny with more information about those who are detained themselves. So what we expect and what we'll be monitoring is that it is used as a last resort only, and that when it is used, it can be properly and reasonably justified, and we'll have information which backs that up.
A few weeks ago there was quite a well-reported case of a couple of teenage girls out at the hut who were allegedly quite seriously mistreated by police over there. And that's been quite seriously criticised. You talked before about there being quite positive cooperation from police on a national level, but there might be some hardened pockets in the community. Will there be special emphasis on training for those police stations where they might be
You would have seen in the report some recommendations about that, about training. So
you
One
mind?
of the real strengths of the report is the idea of joint training for police and child, youth and family. That's a really clever suggestion. When you do joint training between organisations, not only do you both learn the same things and learn a common language, but you also grow the relationships at a local level. So I'm really hoping that that suggestion is taken up. I think it's a very powerful one.
I was just going to say what might be helpful for television purposes anyway, if you could explain it to us. It's in the report, I know, that just doesn't really work for TV. In terms of what's happening at the coal face, at the low level, what are you telling your officers at that, I guess on the beat level, who are dealing with these young offenders in terms of how
I
they should
suppose
assess
it's important to say
situations?
they're not our officers.
Well, sorry, broadly they are.
Dr. Willis. We're making a number of suggestions about training opportunities for those police who are involved in detaining young people, and they are to be joint opportunities, as Dr. Willis says. It's important that child, youth and family and police and health officials and others are involved, and we've made recommendations about that and about how they can do that work together when young people are in detention.
In the same sense, you say in the report that we're using potentially at risk of breaching international guidelines on this area. Can you explain how so?
Well, that might be a human rights.
Well, I mean, basically that having any child in custody is a breach of the convention. So New Zealand, it's not necessarily a breach by New Zealand in the sense that New Zealand has actually reserved the right to do that, and in part because of its geography actually. So we will be monitored internationally. I don't like to emphasise that actually, because I think as New Zealanders, and particularly thinking back to what we told those guys they were fighting for, we have a bigger responsibility to ourselves. We shouldn't be so concerned about international criticism as not living up to what we said we were going to do. I think it's our job to cut the human rights path. This is an area where we can do better.
For those families, sorry, who lost people in tragic circumstances to young offenders who've been out in the streets, what assurances can you give them that you're not just going to be letting them roam,
I suppose we could give this assurance because the report envisages that there will be last resort cases when, for safety and security reasons, it's necessary to keep young people in police detention. What we're saying is that should be as short as possible. They should be treated humanely and well, which is what all of us as civilised people want, and that if they are to be detained in secure places, they should be then other than police cells. And that happens at the moment. We want to ensure it continues.
Dave, just going back to international, compared around the world, where does New Zealand sit in terms of detention and the figures that we're seeing?
I mean, it's not as good as some Western countries, but obviously better than most countries.
What do you weigh?
Well, I mean, I haven't got the exact figures in my head, but many countries keep children in prison. By those standards, we're actually very, very high. And we do have, it's always worth recognising, we have one of the highest levels of realisation of human rights. What we're critical about is largely because of our own expectations of ourselves. And this is where we can say we can do better. In relation to the, it's worth just pointing out that the safety and security of the rest of the community is also a human rights issue. So that the human rights issues are on both sides of this question, and there is no doubt that it's entirely within the human rights framework to keep people in detention if they're a danger to society.
From a human rights perspective, do the figures come as a surprise to you?
No, not really. I mean, this is not an area that I've looked at a lot before I got to this role. But I was aware that we had a significant number of young people in detention, and that was an issue. Yeah.
This is a pretty straightforward question, but again, just for the sake of getting the audio, you talk about how there's a need for the police treatment of young people in detention to improve. What is the situation at the moment? What did you find in the report? How are young people being treated in detention?
I I suppose it varies a bit, and that's part of what the report makes clear. And it varies because there are a wide variety of cells and detention abilities for the police throughout the country. And if you've been to visit police cells for whatever reason, you'll know that there are some cells which are very old, which are cold and drafty, where there are no showering facilities, where simply sleeping, eating, living is uncomfortable and difficult, and some which are modern, well constructed and much better. But none of them particularly cater to young people, don't cater to young people's families visiting them, don't cater always for easy washing, hygienic conditions for young people. So there's a variety throughout the country, and they do often relate to the physical nature of the cells and how long ago they were built. And also, of course, no surprise that in some places with small stations, there's less people around to make sure that young people are looked after well. They've got other jobs to do and pressure on them, so you get a variety of reactions as well.
The Police Association conference has been going on at the moment, and last week rather, one of the issues that they raised was obviously this lack of funding. How big of an obstacle do you think that's going to be, particularly around issues of increasing training, that sort of thing?
I spoke at the Police Association conference, and I spoke with some of those people there privately afterwards. All of them understand that there are special issues about young people in custody. I would think it's pretty fair to say no police invited or wanted particularly, they'll do their statutory job because they have to. Will they have the money to do things differently? Well, they will in places because of course there are plans to continually improve and change cells. One of our recommendations is about designing new police stations and including better facilities if that's going to continue to be the fact in New Zealand, as it will do. And will they have the money to do training and things like that? Police have got a continual training program. I'm sure they'll still be doing that. I can't see how they could forsake it.
Can you, sorry, talk us through what you hope to improve or change in terms of transportation and safety conditions there? It's one obvious case that springs to mind.
Yeah. One of the problems about transport, if I can just briefly say on behalf of the press, one of the problems is our location, our geography. And if something goes badly wrong at the back of Pongaroa, there's immediately a problem about how quickly you can get into detention facilities. Child, Youth and Family have a number of institutions around the country. They are sometimes a long way away from a place where serious trouble might break out. So there are those sorts of problems immediately, and sometimes a practical response is accepted rather than one which is thought through on a longer-term basis. So what we've suggested is, the report suggests, that some thought needs to be given to that before the tragedy and before the event. If we have a problem in our area, how are we going to deal with it now? And what can we do about transporting young people to safe places, rather than just wait for an ad hoc response on the moment.
Has there been some consideration in, say, extending the reach of the Thematic youth court system where they take the youth to a marae and they don't necessarily have to be Māori to be part of that, but that was quite successful. Has there been some kind of extension of that that could help in this area of youth detention?
Shall I reply again?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as you know, there is a extension to the rangatahi model going on, and there are more and more places that are anxious to have that ability in their communities. So I think the emphasis is on doing that part of it better and involving significant people, the young people, in a better way, which is what rangatahi courts seek to do. That'll have its own repercussions if people know that that's wanted, is welcomed, and that those local solutions exist. And we would hope that the strength of families of whānau are always going to be first options for young people anyway. And I can see Dr. Russell nodding, which is very unusual.
One of the kind of the point behind your point is the relationship between police, child, youth and family and iwi. And again, one of the kind of key points in the white paper is about child, youth and family, strengthening a relationship with iwi. and the idea of iwi caregivers. I can't see why that idea couldn't extend to supported back and to specialist caregivers.
Yeah, because I'm just curious because I thought there would be, given that the data's collected on the iwi as well, that there could be some kind of bonus for the iwi to take.
Well, some iwi have a policy that no child from our iwi would be placed outside our iwi. Now, wouldn't it be fantastic if other iwi chose to say the same and partner with Child Youth and Family and Police, using those extensive networks within iwi and Harpoon to make sure that the needs of those young people were met? Wouldn't that be a great use of resource, good use of relationships?
I'm just getting a signal from our communications advisor that it's about time.
Yeah, we've got the room. Any last questions?
Just quickly, you also mentioned the Law Society. You had a message for them. What message will you be taking to the Law Society?
Who's the Law Society? Who mentions that?
Oh, in the report, sorry.
I think one of the messages was about youth advocates and those who are players in the youth court process and the roles in which they can usefully play a part in advocating for young people, for preventing detention, and also for changing from detention as soon as beds and other options become available. One of the things that's pointed out in the review is that very often young people are trained in police cells and then are eventually bailed or find other places. So everyone who's involved, Law Society, youth advocates, nominated people, all have a part to play in that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anyone wants,